13 days. That's the gap between a judge handing Anthropic an injunction and an appellate panel slamming that same door shut. This is Anthropic Pentagon Watch. Today, 2 courts, 2 postures, and court watchers reading tea leaves from a ruling that had already landed. We start at the seam between the benches.
And a second law firm is now billing hours on memos about the wreckage. Stick around. Somebody's getting paid.
So Jones-Walker lays it out clean. Judge Rita Lynn grants the injunction. Then, 13 days later, the D.C. Circuit denies the stay. Same dispute, 2 courts reading it in opposite directions. And the D.C. Circuit ruled on the merits, so they found jurisdiction. No procedural off-ramp this time. The panel actually engaged and still said no.
And that's the part nobody at the other labs should sleep through. A tag built for foreign adversaries just got court-tested against an American company, and it held up.
Which gives every contracting officer a tool the courts have now blessed. Lynn thought it needed more process. The D.C. Circuit disagreed.
Here's the timing comedy. Inside Defense had court watchers saying the notice suggests an unfavorable outcome, when the panel had already handed down the loss. But pair the 2 signals, stay denied, argument going badly, and the runway's gone. The appeal's still breathing. Nobody should mistake that for momentum. And Jones-Walker's memo is written for contractors. Translation: here's how to operate inside classified networks without Anthropic's guardrails. That tells you where the autonomous weapons and surveillance constraints went.
Pull up the DW News explainer from February for contrast. Hegseth's ultimatum was blunt. Drop the safeguards by Friday or risk losing up to $200 million in contracts. The company that wanted a seat shaping the rules is now the precedent everyone else gets measured against. Quite a 4 months.
If today's show was useful, follow us wherever you're listening. The next one will be waiting.
From Mariam Baksh at Inside Defense.
Oral arguments on the merits of Anthropic's opposition to the Pentagon supply chain risk designation will be heard by the same panel of judges that rejected the plaintiff's request for an emergency stay, according to a notice from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, which court watchers say doesn't bode well for the company.
Here's the part that made court watchers nervous back in April. The merits panel was the same 3 judges who had already denied the stay: Henderson, Katsas, and Rao. You're walking back into a room that already told you no.
And notice the date stamp. Charlie Bullock was making that read on April 20th. The stay was denied April 8th. The signal he's calling not great had already landed 12 days earlier.
Right. The suspense was over before the suspense started. Suggests an unfavorable outcome. The panel suggested it in writing the moment they denied the stay.
Procedurally, it's clean, though. The same panel hearing the merits after the emergency posture is routine. It only reads as doom because the emergency ruling already went against them. At this point, watch whether the opinion gives anyone else cover to use the same label. Here's Jones-Walker, LLP.
The panel denied Anthropic's motion for a stay, set oral argument for May 19, 2026, and directed the parties to brief 3 pointed questions. At first read, the 2 rulings seem to be pulling in opposite directions. They are not, quite. Or at least, not yet.
Jones-Walker put a name and a date on the seam everyone keeps talking around. 13 days before the D.C. Circuit denied Anthropic's stay, Judge Rita Lynn out in California called the government's theory Orwellian. Same dispute, 2 courts, 2 very different temperatures. And the firm's read is the interesting one. They're not actually in conflict yet. Different designations, different postures.
Sure, not in conflict yet, but walk it forward. Lynn says Orwellian on a district injunction, the D.C. panel shrugs on a parallel ban, and the panel writes the precedent that sticks. Guess which read survives? What jumps out to me, Jones-Walker is the second firm now writing client memos on this. Once law firms start billing contractors to explain the blacklist, the eviction's already done. They're just charging to navigate the paperwork.
The part with teeth is the 3 questions the panel ordered briefed before May 19th. That's where Lynn's tone and the panel's tone actually have to meet on the merits. In doctrine, not just vibes.
One judge calls it Orwellian. The panel locks in the precedent. That's the doctrine fight I care about, because whatever the panel blesses here doesn't stay parked on Anthropic. The next domestic lab gets labeled with this exact template. Step back for me. When the Pentagon labels a company a supply chain risk, is that basically a blacklist? And what kind of evidence or due process is the government actually supposed to provide before that label starts costing a company contracts?
In practice, yes. It works a lot like a blacklist. The Pentagon declared Anthropic a supply chain risk, effective immediately. Direct quote from the Defense Department's own statement per NPR and the AP. So there was no gradual phase-out, no advance hearing. The designation just kicked in. Per the BBC, this is the first time a U.S. company has ever received the label, which is normally tied to foreign hardware vendors suspected of being espionage vectors. The legal mechanism is Section 3252, which Reuters describes as an obscure law originally aimed at guarding military systems against sabotage, rather than restricting a domestic AI company over content policies. Anthropic's lawsuit, filed Monday, claims the designation violates its free speech and due process rights and causes significant financial harm. Legal experts quoted by Reuters say the administration may have overstepped because the law was never designed to apply to a U.S. company without foreign ties.
So, if the designation is effective immediately, with no apparent hearing, does Anthropic have any immediate legal lever to pause it while the lawsuit plays out? Or does the financial damage just pile up in the meantime?
Exactly. That's what the litigation turns on. Anthropic has said that even under the designation's own language, the vast majority of its customers are unaffected. It applies narrowly to customers using Claude as a direct part of government contracts, per Anthropic's own statement. But whether a court will grant emergency relief and halt the designation while the case proceeds is still unresolved. Watch for an injunction filing or an emergency hearing date. That's the clearest signal of whether Anthropic can stop the clock on the damage. Here's DW News.
U.S. AI company Anthropic is pressured by the Pentagon. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has given the AI company an ultimatum until Friday to agree to give the military full access to the company's AI models, or face cuts of up to $200 million in government contracts. Hegseth reportedly demanded that the AI company drop its safeguards.
So DW posted this back on February 25th. Hegseth's ultimatum: drop the safeguards by Friday or lose up to $200 million in contracts. Watch it now, and it plays like the opening scene of a heist.
It's a useful time capsule. Back in February, the threat was financial, a number and a deadline. 4 months later, that pressure hardened into case law at the D.C. Circuit.
And remember the other hammer in this clip, the Defense Production Act, a Cold War statute built to make factories crank out tanks, now aimed at making one company hand over its autonomous targeting guardrails.
They never had to invoke it, though. Turns out the supply chain risk label and a stay denial did the same job with less paperwork.
Walk the line from this video forward. Ultimatum, blacklist, 7 competitors getting paid to fill the gap, court loss. February, you thought this was a negotiation. June, you knows how it ended.
If you follow Anthropic's Pentagon ties, you might also like the Data Center Daily, a daily briefing on AI compute, hyperscaler CapEx, the power grid, semiconductor supply, and energy markets. Find it wherever you listen to podcasts. You'll find links to every story from today's briefing in the show notes. So if something caught your ear, that's the place to dig in a little further. That's Anthropic Pentagon Watch for today. This is a Lantern podcast.